Hi, Pia, and
Hello.
thanks for agreeing to do this interview. You've Corporate Europe Observatory and Lobby Control have just released a report called "Blaming the Messenger: The Corporate Attack on the Movement for Trade Justice." Could you tell me in a couple of sentences what the report is about?
Well, as you probably know, we had a pretty vibrant trade justice movement in Europe in the past 3-4 years, sparked by the resistance against the EU-US trade agreement, TTIP. This movement was pretty big, pretty successful, but at one moment we started to see an increasing number of very vicious attacks from corporations, their lobby groups, think tanks against this movement. And so we felt, this looks a little bit like a concerted strategy by the corporate sector, so by these actors who would obviously gain most from this agreement. So the report actually looks at the actors that attack the trade justice movement. So that is corporations, but also industry federations, think tanks, lobby groups, and maps some of the key arguments that they use to discredit this movement.
I mean, shooting the messenger tactics are not new. They've been used in the past many times before. But did you come across sort of new types of tactics while researching the report? And in a way, what type of attacks are we actually talking about?
It's as you say, it's very classical shooting or blaming the messenger tactics. So rather than dealing with the arguments that the movement against TTIP brought up in the public domain, the corporate sector refocused on NGOs and questioned their credibility. And the tactics used, I would say, are pretty similar to tactics that we know also from the tobacco industry or the oil industry, and that these industries used, for example, to question the science that showed that smoking kills people and that climate change is man-made. So what we saw in the report is, for example, a tactic that questions the rationality of the NGOs that were criticizing TTIP, a tactic that alleges that they are self-interested, that they are critical of TTIP to attract more funding, so do this campaign work for their own benefit, that they are spreading lies and myths rather than bringing forward fact-based arguments. A lot of the tactics focus on the funding of the NGOs. So we repeatedly came across the accusation that the NGOs and civil society movements that were critical of TTIP were actually funded by Russia, even though there is not a single evidence for this claim. So all these stories, so I would rather say stories than arguments, have the same effect. They question the credibility of the movement, of the NGOs, and also distinguish them, separate them from society at large. So when you wonder, is this NGO doing this work just for the sake of becoming rich, you probably no longer identify with it. And so this creates a rift between NGOs and the public at large. So yeah, it's really these kinds of tactics. And the effect is really that the attention gets drawn away from the argument, from the issue that is at stake. So what is the problem with TTIP or other trade agreements? And really is just about, the type of NGOs and why they are doing this work. So I would say it's rather similar to the tactics we have seen in the past. Also really similar in their simplicity. It's always the same arguments, very little evidence, but it apparently seems to be working.
And why do you think this is happening now?
Well, for this specific debate, I think it's pretty clear. The corporate sector started this strategy of attack after it had failed to convince the public that TTIP or other trade agreements are a good thing. And they tried that, I would say, in the first phases of the debate. They tried to convince the public with all kinds of studies, that allegedly showed that this agreement would create jobs, but we managed in, basically tearing apart these studies. Then they went into a concerted social media campaign. So they tried to copy the tactics of the civil society by, creating groups and trends on Twitter and Facebook and what have you. But that also failed. People weren't interested and obviously didn't believe the arguments. So I think when the corporate sector came to a point where they felt, well, our arguments don't work, they changed the strategy and went forward in shooting the messenger.
Can you tell us about the role of the media in facilitating a more general crackdown on NGOs? Because the report sort of focuses on this as well.
Well, I wouldn't say the media as a whole. In this debate about EU trade agreements, we also had a very positive role of the media that was really interested in, for example, research that NGOs produced. But there were also parts of the media, including parts of the mainstream media, that I would say were shockingly open to the very thin evidence-based attack from the other side. So, for example, there was one very, a report by a think tank called ESALP that mapped the movement against TTIP and other trade agreements. And basically came up with these accusations, these people are funded by Russia, they only do this campaign to become rich, etc. And this report really got a lot of coverage in the mainstream media. And so did wider calls from the corporate sector, and I would say part of the conservative political regime, to really question the funding of NGOs that were critical of these agreements. That also got quite a lot of space in the media, which is, you can say, a bit hypocritical, because it's the same media that are very worried about journalists being arrested in Turkey, about civil society being harassed in Poland and Hungary, and yet in the same media, you have a lot of articles that question whether NGOs that are critical of an EU project like TTIP should receive EU funding. So the media I think it's worth thinking about the role of the media, but maybe not the media as a whole.
Finally, what is the role, if any, really, of the international community, or what could they do, or what type of action should the international community take to protect, the space of civil society?
Well, I guess for states it's pretty clear. I mean, democracy is only as vibrant as its civil society. So I think governments that understand themselves as democratic should always make sure that there is not enough space. But I think for the international NGO or civil society community, there's also work to be done, because I'm not sure if we are aware enough that this is going on, that there are very often concerted campaigns to clamp down, to limit the space for civil society. And I think there is a point to be made to talk about this, to share information about this in civil society, and also to react in a concerted way, rather than just being a bit paralyzed and sitting in front of your Twitter account and just hoping that the storm goes over. I think it's about time that we take this a bit seriously in some of the countries where it's probably a relatively recent phenomenon, and fight back in a coordinated manner as civil society.
Thank you, Pia. This is much appreciated.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Pia.